What kind of man could march into a land of endless forests, frozen rivers, and hostile tribes, knowing that winter itself might be deadlier than any enemy blade? When Roman soldiers crossed the Rhine into Germania, they entered a world that seemed designed to break armies. To men accustomed to the Mediterranean sun, the northern frontier was a realm of bitter winds, sodden earth, and darkness that lingered long into the afternoon. Germania was not a single nation, but a vast stretch of wilderness and tribal territories stretching beyond the Roman provinces of Gaul. In summer, it was green and dense. In winter, it became a place of iron frost and suffocating silence. The Roman legions that operated along this frontier, particularly under commanders like Augustus and later Tiberius, were highly disciplined, but discipline alone could not warm frozen fingers or prevent a man from collapsing in snow. After the catastrophic defeat of Publius Quintilius Varus in the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, Rome understood that Germania was not just a battlefield, it was an environmental trap. Survival demanded adaptation. The first line of defense against winter was infrastructure. Roman soldiers were not merely fighters, they were builders. Upon entering hostile or uncertain territory, they constructed fortified camps known as castra. These were not crude clusters of tents, but carefully planned mini-cities, laid out in precise grids. Even during campaigns, a marching legion would end its day by digging ditches, erecting ramparts, and setting palisades. In winter quarters, these temporary fortifications evolved into more permanent structures made of timber and earth. Inside these camps, soldiers built barracks insulated with packed earth and sometimes lined with wooden planks. Roofs were angled to shed snow, and walls were thick enough to block the wind. In longer-term forts along the Rhine frontier, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of hypocaust-style heating. Systems adapted from Roman bath technology. Though not every barrack enjoyed such luxury, central bathhouses often did, providing soldiers with precious warmth and a place to wash away grime that, in freezing conditions, could quickly become dangerous to health. Clothing was equally critical. Contrary to popular imagery of lightly clad legionaries in gleaming armor, winter on the German frontier required layers. Roman soldiers wore woolen tunics as a base, supplemented by cloaks known as sagum. Wool retained heat even when damp, a crucial advantage in the wet cold of northern Europe. Soldiers also wore braccae, trousers adopted from Celtic and Germanic peoples. Though once considered barbarian attire, practicality overcame pride. In extreme conditions, Roman adaptability meant survival. Boots, or caligae, were reinforced and sometimes modified for winter conditions. Standard caligae, with their open design and hobnailed soles, were excellent for marching but less suited to snow. Archaeological finds suggest that soldiers sometimes wrapped their feet in additional cloth or used enclosed footwear better suited to the cold. Frostbite, while rarely recorded in Roman texts, must have been a constant threat. Diet played a central role in endurance. Roman military logistics were among the most sophisticated of the ancient world. Grain shipments moved along rivers like the Rhine, supported by a network of supply depots. Soldiers consumed wheat in the form of bread or porridge, supplemented by salted meat, cheese, legumes, and occasionally fresh game. In winter, caloric intake was crucial. Fatty foods provided the energy necessary to generate body heat during long watches on freezing ramparts. The Rhine itself became both lifeline and hazard. In warmer months, it served as a supply highway, transporting goods deep into frontier territory. But when winter sealed parts of it with ice, supply lines grew fragile. Soldiers had to prepare in advance, stockpiling provisions before the freeze. Commanders who failed to anticipate shortages risked not only hunger but mutiny. Beyond physical survival lay psychological endurance. Winter magnified isolation, darkness fell early, and forests loomed beyond the torchlight. Germania's tribes were masters of guerrilla tactics, striking from concealment and vanishing into the trees. The Roman soldier on night watch, peering into a snow-laced wilderness, faced not just cold but uncertainty. Every snapping branch could signal an ambush. Discipline was Rome's shield against fear. Daily routines continued regardless of temperature. Weapons were maintained, drills were conducted, guards rotated with mechanical precision. The Roman army's structure left little room for idleness, and that structure became a mental anchor. Even in winter quarters, soldiers trained, repaired roads, and strengthened fortifications. Activity prevented despair from taking root. Religion and ritual also offered comfort. Soldiers carried small shrines within camps, honoring gods like Jupiter and Mars. Offerings were made for protection against both enemy and environment. The Roman worldview interpreted hardship through a framework of duty and divine favor. If winter was brutal, it was also a test of Roman virtue, of disciplina and virtus. Experience transformed vulnerability into resilience. Early campaigns in Germania had been marked by overconfidence. The forests and swamps consumed armies unused to their demands. But after the lessons of Teutoburg, Roman strategy shifted. Permanent fortifications lined the Rhine. Campaigns were more calculated. Wintering deep in hostile territory became rarer. Instead, Rome consolidated defensible positions and extended influence through controlled incursions rather than reckless expansion. Engineering ingenuity further increased survival odds. Roads built with layered stone foundations cut through mud that would otherwise freeze into treacherous ruts. Bridges spanned icy tributaries. Watchtowers dotted the frontier, allowing for early warning. Each structure represented hours of labor, but also a bulwark against chaos. Medical knowledge, though primitive by modern standards, was organized within the army. Each legion had medici, trained medical personnel who treated wounds and illnesses. Cold-related ailments, respiratory infections, and malnutrition were constant concerns. Herbal remedies and basic surgical tools formed part of a standardized kit. Cleanliness, enforced through discipline and bath culture, helped limit disease outbreaks that could devastate cramped winter quarters. The Germanic winter itself was not uniform. Some years were mild, others brought deep freezes that immobilized entire regions. Snow muffled sound, altering the acoustics of patrols and ambushes. Frozen ground simplified marching in some respects, but increased the risk of injury. Armor, cold against the skin, could sap warmth. Even metal weaponry became dangerous to handle without proper insulation. And yet, despite these hardships, Roman soldiers remained. They built forts that endured for decades. They patrolled borders that stretched hundreds of miles. They maintained imperial authority in lands that resisted conquest. Survival was not accidental. It was systematic. As the first heavy frosts settled across the frontier and breath turned to vapor in the air, legionaries tightened cloaks and checked the tension of bowstrings. Fires crackled within fortified walls. Beyond them lay the dark forests of Germania, patient and watchful. Winter was not an event but a season-long siege laid by nature itself, pressing against timber walls and testing every seam of Roman resolve. Winter on the German frontier did not simply threaten the body. It reshaped the entire rhythm of Roman military life. Once the first hard freeze settled across the Rhine and the forests stiffened under frost, the legions shifted from open campaigning to calculated endurance. Movement became slower, heavier, more deliberate. Armor felt denser in the cold, leather straps stiffened, and every breath cut sharply in the lungs. Yet the Roman army was designed for adaptation, and it was this ability to transform routine under pressure that allowed them to hold their line. The fortified camps along the Rhine and deeper within contested territory became self-contained systems of survival. In provinces bordering Germania, such as those later formalized under emperors like Domitian, the frontier defenses evolved into structured zones of watchfulness. Timber palisades gave way over time to more permanent earth and wood ramparts, reinforced gates, and towers overlooking cleared killing fields, where ambushers could not easily hide. Snow that might conceal tracks was deliberately trampled flat around the perimeter to reveal intruders. Nothing in a Roman camp was accidental. Even winter itself was studied, measured, and worked into the defensive plan. Inside the walls, survival depended on order. Barracks housed contubernia, groups of 8 soldiers who shared living space, meals, and responsibilities. This small unit cohesion was critical during winter. Men slept in close quarters not only for camaraderie, but for shared warmth. Body heat mattered. Cloaks doubled as blankets, and shields sometimes blocked drafts along poorly sealed doorways. Fires were carefully managed. Too little heat invited illness. Too much risked suffocation in enclosed spaces. Smoke ventilation was imperfect, and soldiers had to balance warmth against air quality. Fuel gathering became a constant priority. Wood was both lifeline and vulnerability. Patrols were often assigned not for combat, but for cutting timber beyond the safety of the walls. These missions were dangerous, especially when snow absorbed sound and concealed movement. Germanic warriors, intimately familiar with their terrain, could strike wood-cutting parties with sudden ferocity. To counter this, Roman units moved in formation even during resource collection, shields ready, scouts posted ahead. Food supply required equal vigilance. Grain remained the staple of the Roman diet, but in winter the difficulty of transport intensified. Wagons struggled in frozen ruts, river barges risked ice damage. Commanders therefore implemented stockpiling strategies long before the first snowfall. Granaries were elevated to prevent dampness and infestation. Salted pork and beef were rationed carefully. Vinegar diluted in water, known as posca, continued to be consumed, offering a measure of sanitation and flavor to otherwise bland rations. Hunting supplemented supplies when possible. Deer and wild boar roamed the forests, though pursuing them risked overextension. Roman soldiers were not specialized woodsmen like the Germanic tribes, but necessity drove adaptation. Some auxiliaries, non-citizen troops recruited from provinces, possessed skills in tracking and archery that proved invaluable in winter foraging. These auxiliary cohorts often came from colder climates within the empire and were more accustomed to harsh weather, providing both practical knowledge and psychological reassurance. Clothing repairs occupied idle hours. Wool garments frayed under constant use, and wet conditions accelerated decay. Leather workers within the camp patched boots and reinforced straps. Armor maintenance was relentless. Rust could compromise a blade as surely as neglect. Oil was applied to metal surfaces to protect against corrosion from moisture and snow. Every man was responsible for his equipment, and inspections were frequent. Failure to maintain gear invited punishment, but more importantly, it invited death. Training never ceased entirely. Even in snow, soldiers practiced formation drills within the confines of the camp. Wooden practice swords, heavier than real gladi, were used to build strength. Shield maneuvers were rehearsed repeatedly, ensuring muscle memory would not dull during months of reduced campaigning. Winter could not be allowed to erode readiness. The memory of disasters like the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest lingered as a warning of what complacency could cost. Communication along the frontier remained active despite the cold. Signal fires and mounted couriers linked forts across miles of frozen terrain. Messages relayed information about tribal movements, supply status, and weather conditions. In extreme cold, horses required special care, stables were insulated as best as possible, and fodder was rationed with precision. A cavalry unit without healthy mounts was rendered ineffective, so veterinary knowledge was as important as infantry discipline. Morale management occupied commanders as much as strategy. Long winters bred tension. Men far from Italy or Gaul, separated from families for years, faced not only physical hardship but emotional strain. Letters traveled slowly but were treasured. Some forts developed modest communities around them, with traders and families of soldiers settling nearby in more stable regions. These civilian presences softened the psychological edge of isolation, reminding legionaries that they defended not just a line on a map, but a living extension of Roman society. The environment itself occasionally shifted from adversary to ally. Frozen rivers could serve as temporary highways, enabling faster movement of troops across otherwise marshy ground. However, commanders had to judge ice thickness carefully. Miscalculation meant catastrophe. Snow-covered terrain also revealed footprints clearly, allowing Roman patrols to track movements of hostile groups more effectively than in leaf-covered autumn forests. Winter demanded constant reassessment rather than passive endurance. Germanic tribes did not suspend hostilities during cold months. Raids continued, often timed for moments of Roman vulnerability. Yet winter warfare required stamina that not all tribal groups could sustain. Roman logistical depth, though strained, frequently outlasted smaller, less centralized forces. The empire's ability to move resources across vast distances, even imperfectly, gave it resilience that purely local systems struggled to match. Bathhouses, where available, played a surprising role in sustaining health. Heated rooms allowed soldiers to cleanse skin clogged with sweat and grime trapped beneath heavy winter clothing. Cleanliness reduced lice infestations and skin infections, both of which thrived in crowded conditions. While Germania lacked the grand marble complexes of Rome, even modest bath facilities provided measurable benefits to morale and hygiene. Religious observances intensified during the darkest weeks. Festivals tied to the Roman calendar continued within camp boundaries, adjusted for frontier realities. Offerings were made not only for victory, but for survival through the coldest nights. Shared rituals reinforced unity, reminding soldiers that they were part of a force greater than themselves, an empire that spanned from the Mediterranean to the edge of the northern forests. Gradually, as months passed, routines solidified into endurance. What had once felt alien became predictable. Soldiers learned which winds cut hardest across the ramparts, which sections of wall collected drifting snow, which patrol routes froze first. Knowledge accumulated season by season, turning raw recruits into hardened veterans of the frontier. Winter no longer represented chaos but a recurring challenge with known parameters. Still, danger never vanished. A single failed supply convoy, a breached wall during a blizzard, or an outbreak of illness could unravel months of preparation. Survival in Germania was never guaranteed. It was earned daily through vigilance, cooperation, and relentless labor. As snow layered upon the roofs of barracks and the Rhine groaned under sheets of ice, the Roman presence in Germania did not flicker out. Fires burned steadily within the camps, shields lined the walls, and sentries scanned the forest edge through veils of white. The empire's strength on this frontier rested not on grand offensives, but on the quiet, grinding persistence of men who endured the cold one disciplined day at a time. By the time a Roman soldier had endured several winters in Germania, the cold no longer arrived as a shock, but as a grim companion whose habits he understood. The frontier was still unforgiving, but experience transformed fear into calculation. Veterans could read the sky for signs of heavy snowfall, judge the thickness of river ice by color alone, and sense when a forest had gone unnaturally quiet. Survival was no longer reactive, it was strategic. The Roman army's long-term answer to winter in Germania was permanence. Rather than gamble repeatedly on deep penetration into hostile wilderness, imperial policy increasingly favored fortified borders. Along the Rhine and later stretching into controlled territories, Rome developed layered defensive systems that would eventually evolve into what historians call the limes. Under emperors such as Hadrian, frontier management emphasized consolidation over reckless expansion. Germania would not be conquered in a single sweeping triumph. It would be contained, monitored, and slowly influenced. Permanent forts transformed winter survival from seasonal improvisation into engineered stability. Stone foundations replaced vulnerable timber in key positions. Granaries were constructed with ventilation systems that kept stored grain dry even in damp cold. Wells were dug deep enough to ensure water access when surface sources froze. Workshops inside forts allowed blacksmiths, carpenters, and leather workers to operate year-round, reducing dependence on distant supply lines during the harshest months. These strongholds were not isolated outposts, but nodes in a broader network. Watchtowers communicated with one another across valleys and riverbanks. Roads connected forts with remarkable durability, layered with gravel and stone that resisted frost heave better than simple dirt tracks. Even when snow covered them, their firm foundations prevented wagons from sinking into mud during sudden thaws. The Roman genius for engineering reduced the unpredictability of climate by imposing structure upon it. Auxiliary troops played a crucial role in this frontier stability. Recruited from across the empire, including regions accustomed to colder climates, these units brought specialized skills. Archers, cavalry scouts, and light infantry adapted more easily to forest warfare and winter patrols. Over time, interaction between Roman soldiers and local Germanic communities also led to cultural exchange. Some Germanic recruits joined Roman ranks, gaining citizenship after service. Their knowledge of terrain and weather patterns strengthened the army's seasonal preparedness. Winter strategy extended beyond fort walls. Roman commanders understood that denying enemies resources during cold months could prevent coordinated uprisings. Patrols disrupted tribal gatherings and monitored known crossing points along frozen rivers. Intelligence gathering became as vital as swordsmanship. Traders, informants, and allied. Chieftains provided reports about shifting loyalties and planned raids. In winter, when travel was difficult, information could mean the difference between a surprise assault and a preemptive defense. Medical practice continued to evolve in response to frontier realities. Repeated exposure to freezing temperatures taught army medici how to recognize early signs of frostbite and hypothermia, even if they lacked modern terminology. Soldiers were encouraged, sometimes forced, to warm extremities gradually rather than expose numb limbs directly to intense heat. Vinegar washes and herbal salves were applied to prevent infection in cracked skin. Though rudimentary, such measures reflected accumulated knowledge born of repeated winters. Psychological endurance deepened with each passing year. Veterans developed a frontier identity distinct from civilians in Rome. They were guardians of the edge of the known world, standing between imperial order and untamed wilderness. That sense of purpose fortified morale during the darkest days of winter. Shared hardship created bonds that transcended regional origin. A recruit from Hispania, Gaul, or the Balkans might arrive unfamiliar with snow-laden forests, but after several seasons he became part of a brotherhood defined by survival. Religious practices also adapted subtly to the frontier environment. Alongside traditional Roman deities, soldiers sometimes adopted or acknowledged local gods associated with forests, rivers, and weather. Small votive offerings discovered by archaeologists suggest a blending of belief systems, appeasing the spirit of a river that might freeze unpredictably or honoring a woodland deity believed to govern hunting. Success reflected pragmatic spirituality. Survival encouraged flexibility even in matters of faith. Climate itself may have fluctuated during the centuries of Roman presence in Germania, bringing cycles of harsher and milder winters. Yet the army's institutional memory buffered these variations. Records, reports, and experience informed preparations each autumn. Stockpiles were adjusted based on previous consumption rates. Timber reserves were expanded if shortages had occurred the prior year. Rome's bureaucratic structure, often criticized for rigidity, proved advantageous in maintaining continuity across generations of soldiers. The economic dimension of winter survival should not be underestimated. Frontier forts stimulated local trade. Merchants supplied wine, oil, and luxury goods even in remote areas, creating semi-permanent settlements known as vici near major bases. These communities provided additional resources and labor. In return, soldiers spent portions of their pay injecting coin into frontier economies. A stable winter garrison thus became an anchor of regional development, gradually reshaping Germania's borderlands. Despite these advancements, the frontier remained volatile. Large-scale uprisings still erupted, and winter occasionally amplified chaos rather than containing it. Deep snow could isolate forts from reinforcement, sudden thaws could flood defensive ditches. Disease outbreaks, particularly respiratory illnesses, sometimes spread rapidly through cramped quarters. The Roman system mitigated risk but never eliminated it entirely. What ultimately defined Roman winter survival in Germania was not a single innovation but a layered approach. Clothing adapted from local traditions, engineering compensated for environmental extremes, logistics anticipated seasonal disruption, discipline maintained cohesion when fear threatened to fracture morale. Each element reinforced the others, creating resilience greater than the sum of its parts. As decades turned into centuries, the Rhine frontier became less an expeditionary boundary and more a hardened seam between worlds. Roman forts stood as geometric assertions of order against irregular forests. Inside their walls, winters followed rhythms that were harsh yet familiar. Soldiers rotated in and out, some completing service and returning south, others settling permanently in frontier communities. Germania remained unconquered in its depths, but it was no longer an unknowable terror. In the end, survival in the brutal winters of Germania was a testament to Rome's capacity for adaptation. The empire did not thrive because its soldiers were immune to cold or fear. They shivered, they fell ill, they longed for warmer homelands. But they endured because their army functioned as an organism, disciplined, resourceful, and relentless. Winter tested every weakness, exposed every oversight, and punished every lapse in preparation. Yet year after year, the legions lit their fires behind fortified walls and watched the snow gather beyond the ramparts. The forests still whispered beyond the Rhine, and icy winds still swept across the frontier, but the Roman presence did not vanish with the first frost. It hardened. Through engineering, routine, adaptation, and sheer endurance, Roman soldiers transformed one of Europe's harshest climates into a survivable theater of empire.